معنا دكتور حاتم الهبري خريج جامعة نيويورك يونيفرسيتي. حاتم رح يبدأ معنا بالجامعة الأمريكية ببرنامج الإعلام. بدأ معنا ابتداء من الأسبوع الماضي مبدئيا. رح أعطيه الميكروفون تعرف عن حاله أكثر شوي، ورح يعطينا المحاضرة اللي طلبت من الأكاديمية السابقة السنة الماضية عن الإعلام والطائفية والأمور المتعلقة بالموضوع. هي المحاضرة الصعبة اللي ما في كثير كمان مواد عليها. المحاضرة رح تكون بالإنجليزي كمان. حدا عايز headsets؟ headsets؟ No? Alright.
Sabah al-Khair. I'd like to thank our translators for doing such a great job this whole conference and for giving you a better translation than I would have been able to do today. I'd also thank you all for being here. As a newcomer to the media literacy approach, I've greatly enjoyed being a part of the Academy and meeting all of you. The topic that I'll be discussing today is one that I think is essential to understanding media in the contemporary moment in the Middle East and indeed the world. There are many different places in the world where sectarianism defines the political landscape, each of which has its own history, economic dynamics, and social and cultural expression. What I'd like to do in the first part of my talk is to pose a series of points which I think will help us understand sectarianism. And then in the second part, we can collectively analyze a series of examples which I've chosen how they demonstrate ways that media and sectarianism are linked. We're going to focus on Lebanon and Iraq. We'll also look at Egypt. We can also discuss other examples that you guys think of as we go along. I think definitions are very important, and with a term as loaded as sectarianism, we should be careful to use the term in a precise and productive way. By productive, I mean that it helps us understand local and specific situations with the greatest nuance possible, while also having a broader and more general applicability than just the countries I'll be focusing on. For today, I'll define sectarianism as a condition where social and political identity is conflated with religious or ethno-religious group belonging. And belonging to that group, either defined by ethnicity or religion or a conflation of the two, then becomes a defining feature of how people are able to claim political rights, vote, get elected, be represented in government, and so on. We could add a few other important points at the outset. Sectarianism always involves a lot of money, time, work, effort, and violence to continue to function as such. Since it's built on a series of distinctions and ideas which are constantly in transformation and inherently incoherent, it takes a large amount of work to make it seem natural or inevitable. I'd also like to test something just right now. If we can all agree that sectarianism is not necessarily the same thing as personal beliefs and identity, by a show of hands, who here likes sectarianism? Nobody?
English definition.
And how I just...
Personal beliefs?
No. Sectarianism as a process, as it exists in the countries that we're talking about. Nobody, right? Well, like other terms like racism, very few people will openly admit to being sectarian, even when the views they express may in fact be built on sectarian assumptions or have sectarian implications. This is part of why political figures who benefit from sectarianism so frequently accuse each other of being sectarian or acting in a sectarian way. So we have sectarianism without anybody claiming to be sectarian. At the same time, there are many people who claim that religion is an important part of who they are. So I think the term sectarianism has a number of misconceptions attached to it, which help feed a range of ideological uses of the term in news entertainment, popular culture, political speeches, and so on. So we have many people for whom religion is an important part of who they are, while at the same time we have few people who claim to be sectarian. And then we have the ideologically loaded use of the term sectarianism and related phrases that you hear all the time in news, such as sectarian violence, sectarian tensions, sectarian tribal leaders, which usually are doing a kind of political work. So we have this set of paradoxes, right? The question becomes, how can we make sense of this as media literacy advocates, as critically minded people? The most important thing that a critical perspective on sectarianism can offer is how groups of people become sectarian, how politics becomes sectarian. To grasp sectarian as a system means that we have to go beyond individually held opinions, beyond even just a basic inventory of sectarian stereotypes. We have to look at how a social system is made up of more than just the sum of its parts. I've been asking myself how to understand the relationship between media and sectarianism for some time, and I've never found the standard explanations satisfactory. In part, this is because ideas about media and sectarianism are often shaped by what people think the relationship is between media and religion. Other times, people interpret sectarianism in a simplistic way. The people who end up identifying with one political party and their media are kind of dumb, easily influenced, or just unwilling to take a hard look at their own political views. While many people who end up espousing sectarian views might actually be that way, I don't think that explains it. Even less satisfying are explanations which try to explain sectarianism as some kind of inevitable clash of ideas. Generally speaking, the people who are very moved by theological debates are not typically the same kind of people who join militias. And this brings me to my central point. How we understand the relationship between religion and media is an underlying assumption for how we understand sectarianism and media. So to get to a sophisticated critical perspective, we need to look at this underlying assumption first. We need to expand our understanding of religion as it relates to media, and expand our understanding of media as it relates to religion. Both things, I think, help us understand the other. And then both of those together help us understand sectarianism more broadly. So I'm going to make 6 points divided into 3 pairs, which hopefully will follow from each other. Point number 1 is that there's no such thing as religion. There is no such thing as religion. It does not exist. Religion does not exist. And I've lost everyone. You can see people thinking he seemed like he was okay, and now he's lost the... But for real, religion does not exist. The good news is that there's a good reason to not believe that religion with a capital R exists. This reason is that the idea of religion, capital R, is itself a misnomer, a term that systematically misdescribes both the history of religious traditions and the relationship to varieties of secularism and sectarianism. Despite what many people would have you believe, no religion has ever been just one thing, one sort of eternal set of ideas passed down without alteration or interpretation, one set of practices, one set of rituals, one way of relating to media, one way of relating to a community of believers. It's not religions are not some kind of timeless essence. To begin with, the view of religion as the literal interpretation of religious texts is a specifically American and Protestant one. Not only that, it's a pretty recent idea, which we can date to more or less about the middle of the 19th century. To be sure, many of the cultural transformations that what historians of the US call the Second Great Awakening were in part an outcome of the range of Protestant traditions which emphasized that salvation could only be had by each person reading the truth of the Bible for themselves. Kind of a media literacy idea. In the early 20th century, those same movements would come under attack by another movement who would describe themselves as fundamentalists, a group of people who were arguing that the only way for things to be right in the world were to get back to the fundamentals of the faith, and only then could there be a true revival of the Christian message. Consequently, when people describe religious movements as fundamentalist, it's usually a misapplication of the term. That kind of sort of describes how one group of people describe themselves, but might not help us really understand other situations elsewhere, such as in the Middle East. To take this point a step further, what advocates and critics who debate the value or consequences of religion based on a literal interpretation of its texts, we can understand Muslims by looking at this passage in the Quran, we can understand this religious group by looking at this part of their holy text or tradition, is itself exactly how fundamentalists want to see themselves. Social formation or a social construction of religion is not some kind of inevitable outcome of the ideas underpinning it. This is a conceit on behalf of a particular kind of belief about the history of religion. Religious beliefs and practices are multiple and do not have the kind of coherence or internal consistency that the idea of capital R religion has. So I'm saying that this version of what religion is sort of a fiction. But if capital R religion does not exist, if that idea is sort of a fiction, what about the multiple realities that exist? This is where I think we need to make a different sort of critical move. A simplistic idea of critiquing media is to say what's in the media is a misrepresentation, it's false, and reality is something true, and there's just a simple misinterpretation of the truth. So am I arguing that religion is real or not? Actually, I want to have it both ways.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
But the choice between the blue and the red pill is not really a choice between illusion and reality. Of course, Matrix is a machine for fictions, but these are fictions which already structure our reality. If you take away from our reality the symbolic fictions that regulate it, you lose reality itself. I want a third pill. So what is the third pill? Definitely not some kind of transcendental pill which enables a fake fast food religious experience, but a pill that would enable me to perceive not the reality behind the illusion, but the reality in illusion itself.
He digresses on to his own point, but I like that idea. A pill to perceive the reality in illusion itself. That sectarianism is a sort of fiction which has been given a concrete reality. It's a fiction that we all end up having to participate in no matter how much we disagree with it or dislike it. This idea of a reality in illusion itself, fictions which structure the real world, sounds like a perspective better equipped to deal with the reality of stories like sectarianism, told on behalf of religious communities. While there's no such thing as religion with a capital R, what you do have are histories of religions, lowercase h and lowercase r, which have taken different forms, with different emphases, in different kinds of contexts. I think that we can take this point further, that religious traditions are often a way of telling a story about their own history, especially about their own origins. So for example, stories about the founder of a religion often take the shape of a demonstration of connection of the believing community to a divine presence, which then continues a few times since the moment of the beginning of the religion. Other times, the history of the religious community is described in terms of a historical process. Things aren't going well, it's because you've been led astray and are being punished, time to get back to the real faith, etc., etc. Other times, the relationship to time is about an endpoint to history. Once everyone is converted, everything will be right with the world, and the divine will return in some capacity. There's a wide range of ways that religious beliefs and practices have made sense of time and interpreted the history or beginnings of the community of believers. But the work to keep traditions alive in a way that resembles the past is itself a distinctly modern effort. This is a contemporary thing. The more they try to go back to a previous point in time, the more they start to sound modern or even late modern or postmodern or whatever term you want. So if we want a critical understanding of the place of religion in the contemporary world, then we have to have a historical understanding of how different religious beliefs and practices have varied across time, changed in different circumstances, all the while trying to keep a coherent sense of their own history in the face of the contingency and political ruptures that actually define them. And this is before we consider the role of media in shaping how people perceive history. And so it is with sectarianism. So, point number 2. In the modern era, religions are primarily defined by the relationship to modern nation states and to capitalism. They're just as much a product of these things as they are anything else. By the time we get to the 1800s, a series of massive upheavals began in Europe and its outsides, which continue to fundamentally define the present day. I'm referring to the rise of the modern nation-state system in both the colonial and the decolonial periods, and the role that the emergence of capitalism within that system has played in the reorganization of everyday life worlds in that process. This is a potentially immense topic, so let me shift to a concrete example. So this is a picture of my local mukhtar. I'm not sure the best way to translate mukhtar to English, but it's something like an official notary public who handles most of your paperwork as it relates to things like marriage, birth, death, basic legal proceedings, identification papers, papers that need to go to other ministries. Most recently, I went here to register marriage, which in Lebanon, you both have to get documentation from the official religious institution or body who can grant you the right to marry. And you then have to register that with the state, and all of this happens through the mukhtar's office. So we could also see muhtars as this kind of much older institution, which go back to at least the time of the Ottomans. Sometimes the office of the muhtar stays in the same place across centuries. The muhtar's office right here near Bliss Street on Jeanne d'Arc Street has been there since about the mid-19th century, like in the same building. So let me ask a question. How many different media technologies do you see in this office?
We have, but not use it. We have laptops or computers,
Laptops, computers,
printing machine.
printing machines.
Should we have iPhone or mobile something?
What else?
Phone.
Maybe you have something for the money to check its money it's fake or not. Was it this close?
If he does, I'm not sure if he has one. What else? What other media technologies say on his desk?
He has a religious symbol, calendar with a religious symbol.
He does. He has a calendar with the Islamic lunar calendar on it. Any others? There's a fundamental one here which we've missed, which is paper. What would bureaucracy be without paperwork? What would getting your papers done be without the registries, the card catalogs, the photocopy machines, the fax machines, the file folders, the filing systems? I say all of these are also media technology. They certainly were new at one point, even though they don't seem as cutting edges right now. So as you can probably tell, there are many types of media technology that play large and small roles in society, many of which we tend to forget when we think of the media, whatever media is meant to refer to. The first step to expanding your understanding of the relationship of media and religion is by looking at the role played by old media like paper, books, incense, acoustic architectures, and the like, alongside whatever still continues to feel shiny and new for us in the contemporary moment. iPhone 4, probably not as new. But more to the point, the reason why I'm showing you this picture is to argue that sectarianism is an everyday, legal, and bureaucratic phenomenon through which people's religious group affiliation comes to define how they are citizens of a country. This is something that you're born into unless you do your conversion paperwork, which many do to alter, like in Lebanon, do to alter how their children can inherit from them, how divorce proceedings can work, and so on. In Lebanon, we can date the creation of official sectarianism to the Mandate period, when Lebanon became its own country after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. People who are familiar with this history, I apologize if this is sort of extremely compressed and I gloss over the other important points. This new political system was created by the French in collaboration with political elites in Lebanon at the time, under the pretext of creating a power-sharing agreement between different religious groups so that no one group could dominate others, guaranteeing a kind of nominal protection of mutual destruction of religious minorities. It made it so different top positions in government could only be held by people of specific groups, and the number of parliament members was divided up similarly. This is the same basic system that is in place today, with some minor modifications made at different points of political collapse or crisis. And political collapse and crisis, of course, seems to be endemic to every sectarianism system I've studied. Of course, the French influence predated the Mandate, and most historians agree that the creation of the sectarian system has its roots at least back as the Ottoman Tanzimat period of reform, which began about the middle of the 1800s. At the time, under pressure from the European powers who owned increasingly large amounts of Ottoman foreign debt, Istanbul changed the mode of citizenship to grant to non-Muslims a different sort of status based on their rights as a group of minorities, which had the inadvertent consequence of making political rights be based on religious communal belonging. The irony is that a series of reforms, which on the surface were meant to create a secularized citizenship, which religious minorities could then enjoy, in fact created in a land which was not yet a country, and that was comprised of a far more ethno-religiously mixed public than, say, France or England. It created a dynamic in which politics and political violence were mobilized on sectarian lines. This is not to say that the period before French influence or Ottoman reform was just peachy keen and everything was great, nor should we underestimate how the people who became Lebanese in the 20th century excelled in playing the geopolitical game of local sectarianism. A similar strategy we can see was pursued after the American invasion of Iraq. The results of remaking the political system into one which sectarian and ethnic power sharing is the way things work have had devastating results, but with the key twist of happening after many years of the Ba'ath invasion of Arab nationalism and state building. We could continue to look at the history of sectarian political systems, but as you can see from just this kind of quick dive into a kind of twisted and tangled history, is that the typical experience of getting marriage paperwork done in Lebanon is a point at which religion is reworked by an encounter with the modern state. This is how you have a multiple history of sectarianisms, or religious communities which have had to adapt to the sectarian system. I'm thinking of Max Weiss's book called In the Shadow of Sectarianism. There's also a complicated way that religion encountered and informed and was deployed by the different flavors of Arab nationalism, many of whom spoke explicitly against sectarian or even religious identities as the basis for national belonging. So sectarianism in its current form in the Levant is defined by the politics of modern or late modern nation states and their curious relationship to global capitalism. That is to say, they are equally defined by the system of social and economic relations which successfully works both with autocratic regimes or with welfare states or without welfare states, and countries like Lebanon, where a ruling class has at times seen fit to take over the state. So like Professor Sojali, who I think has already left, I'm going to return to the issue of capitalism again and some of the points that follow. Point number 3, and it gets more interesting here because I'm going to start talking about media more. The relationship between media and religion is not primarily about causing belief per se. This doesn't mean that engaging with media doesn't play an important role in how people come to reaffirm, reject, or negotiate how they understand themselves as members of a religious community or as believing members of a religious community. What I am suggesting is that we expand our understanding of the role of media. First, we should not assume that the primary way that media are important is that they influence opinion or shape belief. Rather, we should understand religion and media as a set of social and cultural forms of belonging and identity, or objects around which belonging and identity come to be expressed. It is who or what people come to feel they are as a community and as individuals that might actually be more important to look at. This is not to say that all people who claim to hold firm religious convictions are being disingenuous, but just because that is what they see as the most salient aspect of who they are does not mean that it is the most important point for a critical perspective on media, religion, and then sectarianism. I think it's actually exactly this: the importance placed on correct belief, behavior, moral conduct, and even attitudes towards media and popular culture, that itself needs to be contextualized as part of a much broader sort of study and analysis. It would be a mistake to grant our analytical focus to the perspective whose formation we are trying to explain. Instead, I think we need to understand the role that beliefs and disbeliefs play in how people come to understand their place in the world. Side note here is that we could also include beliefs about media technologies, public space, and popular culture as important sites of articulation, but that's maybe a side point. Not only that, many religious groups have proven to be very adaptable to the social and economic dimensions of capitalism and its structuring of everyday life and leisure. I'm thinking of the great book, Leisurely Islam by Lara Deeb and our own Hatem. For example, the family ties and gendered selves in the countries we are discussing are impacted as much by the demands of work and how economic life is structured under capitalism in its contemporary moment as anything else. This brings me to point 4. In their historical eagerness to adopt the newest media technologies, religions have always already transformed how they believe, the how of how belief happens. I once heard a really smart observer of media say that there are 3 types of organizations who are always on the cutting edge of media technology. If you want to see the most bleeding edge use of media technology, you don't necessarily look at tech companies, you look at 3 types of organizations: sports, pornography, and religious groups. And in a sense, that shouldn't surprise us, as these are endeavors that can always find one more follower, convert one more person, find one more way to bring their message to the public. Media have always been central to the religions that try to convert people, that place a deep emphasis on spreading the word. And I think it's a really curious phrase, spreading the word. A kind of spatial movement of the word as a kind of physical object or idea that lives inside people and then spreads across space and time. But what are we to make of so-called religions of the book when they adopt new media technologies such as the steam-powered rotary printing press, which fundamentally alters the way that books circulate in society and how people can read them? Or things like cinema, or even things like satellite broadcasting. In adopting the media and cultural processes of the world they deem secular, they actually adapt too well. These cultural techniques transform the condition of possibility of communal belonging and of the sacred to increasingly resemble the profane cultures, spaces, and practices that surround them. I think Derrida gets it right, and I don't usually say that, when he says that insofar as the monotheistic religions are based on cultures of reading, hearing, and seeing, their historical adoption of new media technologies is sort of like the acquisition of an autoimmune disorder. The more they adopt new media in any period, the more they fundamentally change how they believe, the conditions under which people believe and belong to the faith, undermining what it means to do so in any kind of traditional sense, and itself built on top of a long and deep history of having always already transformed themselves through history in this way by adopting new media habits. the more they try to introduce an original sense of being in the presence of the divine word or to reconnect with the history of their tradition, the more the need for yet newer media experiences, and the more this need intensifies. And the more they come to differ from the social and cultural forms of days past. The recitation of religious texts is a fundamentally different thing after the advent of sound recording and amplification. It's a very, very different thing. How you can build spaces becomes different. How people can listen to official religious figures becomes very, very different. We can even be a little more contemporary. How many people here waited around for the announcement of iftar this past Ramadan in front of a TV? By show of hands. How many people listened for the adhan? How many here listened to adhan that wasn't amplified? All of these cases, you're doing something fundamentally different from how things used to be before these technologies. I'm not some kind of media determinist who thinks media technologies have effects on their own. What I think is much more interesting is how the capacities and affordances of technologies are deployed by these different kinds of groups. Who else here, for example, knows people who are religious, who have a religious texts on their tablet computer, on their iPad? A few people have heard of this. Who here has heard or seen people who have like reminders for prayer at different times as like an app on their phone? There's nothing sort of inherently antagonistic between religion and like the newest media technology. I think this insight can be extended to the story of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on the mountain, which I think is like the original press conference. Sort of like God said, here, I'll give you the divine commandments in written form, but on condition that you come along and you can't bring any journalists. Like only you get this tablet. And of course, it didn't suffice for the divine word to just be imprinted onto stone. But isn't there something different between that older form of social media, reading stuff on pre-paper manuscripts, and watching Charlton Heston? So this is the scene in the biblical epic, The Ten Commandments from 1956, when Moses is descending from the mountain after having received the tablet.
Woe unto thee, O Israel! You have sinned a great sin in the sight of God. You are not worthy to receive these 10 commandments.
They're gathered against you, Lord. You take too much upon yourself. We will not live by your commandments. We are free.
There is no freedom without the law.
Whose law, Moses? Yours? Did you carve those tablets to become a prince over us?
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me. Blasphemers, idolaters, for this you shall drink bitter waters. God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
So before we had superhero movies or Lord of the Rings, we had biblical epics. Now, I could not overemphasize how big of a blockbuster movies like this were at the time. The largest production budgets, the biggest and most elaborate sets, most in-depth research into ancient Egypt and biblical history and so on and so forth, consultations with experts, massive audiences, year-long running times in the cinemas. People who were disbelievers were stressed of how impressive a spectacle it was. Again, this is at a time where cinema going was sort of at its height in America in the 1950s. And this genre spread and informed many other styles of, or many other religious traditions as well. So the Hollywood genre of the biblical epic created new ways to experience the stories of their faith or the faiths of others. Nothing wrong with that. But there's something entirely different about those special effects than those of a sermon in a 14th century cathedral with stained glass, or in synagogues before the story of Moses was a Christian story, or later a Muslim story. Very different kinds of experiences, very different kinds of being together as a community of believers. Watching this in the theater is very different than watching a YouTube clip like this, different again from reading the stories of Moses in the Bible itself. Ultimately, we can start to see that it is technology itself, or the experience of technology, which comes to have a bit of the halo of the sacred. In the contemporary moment, museums, airports, and casinos all come to have features that resemble shopping malls and multimedia concert halls. To that list, we could also add many kinds of religious sites and gathering places to talk about architecture for a minute. One example is the phenomenon of the American megachurch, which oftentimes have gift shops, live broadcasts, annual budgets in the tens of millions of dollars. Many of them claim weekly attendance over 20,000 people. You have guest bands, you have schools within them, you have shopping malls and cafes and cafeterias as part of the church complex, which have parking lots which resembles those of shopping malls. We could also look at a different phenomenon, such as the construction of the new clock tower in Mecca, which I don't think resembles Dubai as much as it resembles Las Vegas, or maybe it resembles Las Vegas because it resembles Dubai. The new construction of this kind of monumental architecture are part of a similar kind of trend. And there's actually, I found a documentary which has been produced by this, which again is sort of really excited about how big of an engineering task this was. Sort of like documentaries on the Discovery Channel about like the biggest bridges or extreme engineering.
Mecca, the holy city of Islam, the destination for millions of Muslim pilgrims from all over the world. Directly next to the central shrine rises an architectural masterpiece of superlatives, the world's largest clock tower. If you build a clock tower in Mecca, you cannot just download a blueprint somewhere off the internet. Building contractors from over 10 countries are taking part in construction. The greatest obstacle is that only Muslims are allowed to enter the construction site in Mecca. It felt as if I couldn't be there for the birth of my own daughter. The construction breaks all dimensions and presents the engineers with a huge challenge.
We are at a height of 600 meters and wind will be our biggest enemy.
The wind blows without end. Installation looks bound to fail. 98 million glass mosaic tiles with 24-karat gold leaf adorn the external facade. The highlight? A prayer room within the crescent at the top of the tower. First we had an idea, and now it became reality. That's amazing.
Right, so the trailer makes it look like that kind of Discovery Channel documentary. The stress is on sort of the monumentality of the architecture. Like if you go to their website, 35 times larger than Big Ben. This many, bolts of steel. and that kind of thing. We could also come back a little closer to home. I believe everybody, or everybody who wanted to, went to the Levant Museum this past weekend. People went to the Levant Museum? I think we can also look at the Levant Museum of the Resistance as a similar kind of catering to contemporary tourism. Despite the claims to a large national story that the museum makes, and the theological resonance that Hezbollah often gives to their own battlefield performance, think of things like the Divine Victory of 2006, Melita has much more in common with US Civil War monuments and museums than it does with shrines and holy sites now endangered by the sectarian iconoclasm of Daesh. What continuously results from attempts to extend the sacred with modern media technologies and cultural forms is the sacralization of that which is otherwise considered profane, irreparably blurring the line between the two. And this is before we consider how, for example, commercials for frozen French fries can appear on one satellite channel, reruns of Game of Thrones on another, and a religious sermon on the next, as your average satellite viewer kind of flips between all of them. None of this to say is that new media undo sectarianism. Quite to the contrary, if the post-Civil War history of Lebanese broadcasting is any measure. As Jad mentioned during the Q&A of an earlier lecture, since politics continue to be organized in Lebanon along sectarian lines, political clout transformed into the ability to get a broadcasting license. Or in a different media sphere, the protection to publish critical material which might otherwise have been censored without it. The question to ask becomes, what textures and vectors does sectarianism acquire with the transformation of media landscapes? So, our last pair of points before we analyze some examples together. These last 2 points will help us extend our understanding of religion in general to sectarian formations more specifically. They'll help us make the conceptual shift from one about religions to religious groups, with an emphasis on groups as a social structure. Point 5. Many religious groups are way ahead in terms of media literacy programs. Many are very into the idea of educating people as to how to think about media or how to use media. I don't just mean by saying they're way ahead, I'm being kind of sarcastic, but I mean that it would be difficult to rival the dedication, budgets, and existing audiences that religious groups have. I mean that an attention to media has historically been important to religious institutions, especially if we think of how religious institutions pay attention to media or popular culture that they see as dangerous or having a corrupting influence, or forms that could have a potential power for good, however they define good. So there are 2 impulses here that I think are very interesting to unpack. The iconoclastic impulse, the desire to criticize or destroy images or false idols, and what we can call maybe the publicity impulse, the desire to construct images and put out messages that are sort of the truth. Although I don't think it's clear as to how best to characterize what kind of group they are, I think Daesh distilled these 2 impulses, the iconoclastic and the publicity impulse, in an interesting way. First, the desire to destroy the false idols or religious sites, which they seem to think introduce an inappropriate relationship to the sacred, or attitude to the history of faith, is kind of the radical conclusion of that mode of thinking. That not only do we have to criticize or teach people to be critical about false images, we have to actually physically go and destroy them, or even destroy those places that are actual physical sites or physical architecture. While a very crude form of critique, it's something like an attempt at media literacy. Secondly, Daesh seemed to be particularly into the idea of digital and social media in particular. So this is a report on ISIS and social media put out a couple of months ago by Channel 4 News.
Youthful would-be international jihadis are answering their call of duty. From the aspirant caliphate and the emerging Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, a stream of violent viral videos filmed and professionally edited. To the young and impressionable, this is the stuff of dreams, culty and cool, ISIS fighters, the new rock stars of global jihad. Online, on YouTube, a string of foreign fighters urged their brothers to support the ISIS 1 billion campaign this Friday. The aim, to get young Sunni Muslims across the world to step up to the mark and show their support for what's happening now in Iraq. More than twice as many Brits have now signed up to wage jihad in Iraq and Syria as joined the Army Reserve here last year. Our training camps are open, so is our battlefield, a voice purporting to be that of the leader of ISIS says in this video. Come on, youths of Islam, let's take Baghdad together. His is no ragtag flip-flop army. He runs a pipe ship and fastidiously documents the jihadists' results, possibly to impress donors. This, their annual report for the Islamic year 1434, that's 2013. Al-Naba, news updates of the Islamic nation's military operations in Iraq and Al-Sham. Its 410 pages are packed with facts, figures, goals and strategies and details of 7,681 military operations it claims last year. Numbers it's killed in car bombs, using suicide vests, motorbikes, timed IEDs and rockets. It claims 1,000 assassinations, 1,000 sniper kills and control over 8 cities.
They have a business plan. It is also very much like a military organization in the sense that their primary business is expansion through conquest, but they very clearly keep great records, and they have done that historically too. And it's a very effective institution in that sense. The principles that make for an effective multinational corporation are also probably present in this group.
And as befitting a transnational with global vision, the ISIS media wing, Al-Furqan, which produces the slick videos, has a grasp of how to use social media, which puts other big brands in the shade. In April, they launched an app called Dawn of Glad Tidings. Dawn, as it became known, could be downloaded for free from Google Play, the app store for Android phones. The clever bit is how the Dawn app then takes over, hijacking your phone and turning you into a propaganda jihadi. The app posts official ISIS tweets automatically to Twitter accounts. These tweets include shocking pictures, links to videos, news and keywords with hashtags, all calibrated to trend on Twitter while evading spam detectors. To Facebook generation jihadis, the battleground of the Twitter sphere is as real and as important as black flags on the ground. This picture was tweeted out tens of thousands of times this past Sunday. It shows that black flag flying over the Iraqi capital. The caption, Baghdad, here we come. The recruitment and radicalization drive is mirrored on YouTube and Facebook. There's the ISIS Show podcast, and the British jihadi interviewed on that, who tweets out this ISIS selfie, which points up the Kalashnikov cache.
I think ISIS are definitely the coolest or kind of most seductive outfit right now to the young people, because they've understood the value of having a strong brand, a sort of corporate identity that people can engage with.
No wonder David Cameron's warned of the
I'm never sure if Daesh more resemble the villains of racial paranoia on shows like 24 or Homeland, or parodic caricatures of those villains. Gives me a headache. At any rate, the explicitly sectarian rhetoric and violence that define Daesh help to draw out an important set of issues for sectarianism more generally. The first is that in places that have developed official sectarian politics, which in Iraq's case was deliberately created by an invading army, oftentimes devolve into violence as a way to send and receive messages, killing as itself the message you're trying to send, torture and maiming and all those other kinds of horrible things. If the relationship between religion and media tends towards a sacralization of technology, sectarianism, like the nationalisms that it often refers to, often winds up sacralizing the political technology of violence. This pedagogy of violence is one that underlies the foundation of all nation states, in which the peddlers of sectarianism claim to deplore even while participating and perpetuating it. Now, I should also stress that not all sectarian difference is defined by this kind of violence. There are other forms and traditions based on mutuality and exchange, oftentimes in the face of the divisiveness that comes to characterize the sectarian power jockeying. I have in mind here everyday attempts by average people to remember a time when, say, a neighborhood might have been more mixed or insistent that things did not used to be the way that they are now. This kind of optimistic turn highlights that violent attempts to divide should not be understood as the reversion to something old, but are the products of very contemporary conditions, an attempt to create something new. And this brings me to my last point before we'll look at some examples together. Sectarian others are often described in ways informed by the history of racism or racisms. I think we can see this at two different levels of analysis. One, that of specific sectarian encounters, which are interpreted through a racial imaginary or lens. And two, the way that sectarianism, both a cultural imaginary and political system, is shaped by broader cultural discourses of race and civilizational progress. Just to clarify, I don't think these are two different things. I just think they're two different levels at which we can see racism as thoroughly suffusing sectarianism and ideas about the religion of sectarian others. Because of course it's always the religious or sectarian other, either next door, across the sea, across the airwaves, who is the cause of unhappiness in the world, the cause of the problems that we, good people of country ABC, are having. It's usually an irrational other depicted as especially susceptible to influence by media, or prone to violence, inappropriately sexual, and who are of a basically kind of pre-modern condition, because of course people want to see themselves as the opposite of all those things. Now there are a number of historical examples which I think will help flesh this out a bit more. But there's three in particular which I think can help us understand sectarianism and race in the Levant. So I'll begin in a very different context, the US, and then travel eastward to contemporary Iraq. The first case is that of anti-Catholic sentiment in America in the 19th century, which at the time was predominantly populated by people of various Protestant denominations. The rapid increase in public expression of anti-Catholic sentiment, and even political mobilization, was in part a response to the increase in immigrants from historically Catholic countries in Europe to the US. Most notably here are the wave of Irish immigrants following the potato famine in the middle of the 19th century. Now, many nativists, as they called themselves without any sense of irony, decried what they saw as the infiltration of the country by immigrants who they called papists, who were at best uncouth, dirty, and vaguely animalistic, and at worst treasonous and loyal to Rome, and on that basis should not be given political rights or citizenship. So here's a question. Who here would consider the Irish to be white? By show of hands. Who here does not consider them to be white? Now, let me ask it differently. Who here thinks that the Irish are commonly considered to be white now? Wasn't always the case. As Nell Painter shows or explains in his book, The History of White People, the Irish didn't used to be considered white. They were considered so far from what whiteness, the idea, was meant to represent, that they came to be associated with sort of a quasi-blackness. Now this might seem completely crazy to us nowadays, right? And in part because racism is incoherent and makes no sense, especially when you take it out of context. It seems bizarre or like a non sequitur. But if you look at how Irish characters were, say, drawn in political cartoons at the time, they're drawn as sort of ape-like, kind of not fully developed as human beings. You had male and female variations of this. Now, they were in the racial schema of like the mid-19th century U.S. The Irish were definitely like maybe a bit above black people and maybe whiter than Chinese immigrants, but certainly not the same thing as people from England or Germany or other Protestant countries. And they were completely treated as though not only are these people politically disloyal, but they don't have like the mental faculties or emotional maturity to have the right to vote. Now, you could also have a moment here where many people who are involved in the abolitionist movement in the U.S., who were sometimes accused of being fanatics in their opposition to slavery, saw that how Irish immigrants were being described had a similarity to how blacks were historically described. And of course, most, maybe not surprisingly, many Irish immigrants quickly sought to distance themselves from people they saw themselves as inferior. Now, so how can we have some insight into this? Well, first, we have to understand this is in part a product of the potato famine. And interpreting the potato famine and its cause became a way to talk about the meaning of British hierarchy, either as a thing that nostalgically should be longed for, or as something which was itself kind of oppressing people, depending on where people sat on the political divide. It built on a much longer tradition of anti-Catholic sentiment in the U.S. It isn't until the 1960s that you have a Catholic who is elected president. It happened in the existence of like a deep conspiracy culture, like secret Catholic conspiracies to assassinate the president or take over this state, or look how they're all moving into this town, they're going to take over our town. And of course, all conspiracy cultures always have kind of like a dirty underbelly, right? These kinds of racial imaginaries are also always sexual as well. And this is where we get the figure of like the dirty nun. This whole fiction developed about nuns and their dirty secrets and what happens in nunneries and that kind of thing. We'll have weird imaginaries. You also had a set of political groups which emerged around this, but they didn't really gain much political traction in terms of getting elected to office. You know, they won some local and municipal elections, passed some like local zoning laws banning Irish from living in certain neighborhoods, but that anti-immigration ticket didn't really get very far. The second example is that of the 19th century American mission encounter with what is now Lebanon. At the time it was Ottoman Syria, or maybe the Ottoman Mutasarrifiyya of Beirut. As Osama Muqdisi examines in his book Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, the mission encounter of that period was driven by at least two different racial tensions. The first was the unsatisfactory progress of Puritan missionaries with Native Americans, whom they saw as benighted savages in need of total transformation into a Christianity which represented the ultimate culmination of the promise of America. This, of course, required ignoring how the white man was engaged in an eliminationist settler colonialism in the continent supposedly recently discovered. You have to sort of ignore that that's going on when they're trying to demonstrate their moral superiority, which supposedly moral superiority demonstrates why people should convert. This was met with lukewarm reception at best. Very few converted, at least at that point in time. The peoples of the so-called Eastern churches, which is what Protestant missionaries in the U.S. describe Christian faiths here in the Middle East, were thus taken to be a prime opportunity to fulfill the missionary imperative to spread the word. Key to the evangelical approach was the belief that missionaries could convert Christian peoples to their form of Christianity from what faiths that they saw as misled, hopelessly trapped in superstitious dogma and practice. The primary method to do so was to engage in biblical interpretation. This is here we can see this tendency towards an emphasis on personal interpretation of the Bible as the only way to salvation. As Osama Muqdisi argues, the apotheosis of American exceptionalism thus marked the moment in mission history when American nationalism, racialism, and evangelism fused together in a manner that obviated any further discussion of American shortcomings and escalated criticisms of those un-American places in the world yet to be saved by American missionaries. We don't have to pay attention to our own incoherences if we can go and save these other people. But at the same time, they didn't convert a single person. There was one person from the Maronite faith who kind of became like a contentious partial conversion, but he ended up being killed and claimed as a martyr by all sides, deemed a heretic by the Catholic Church. So in this frustrated attempt at the conversion of the Middle East and Lebanon, and how it transformed missionary work, how that encounter happened led to the founding of the Syrian Protestant College, which later became American University of Beirut, and us in this room right now. Makdisi argues that the founding of the Syrian Protestant College was not so much an act of cultural imposition as it was a final recognition of the futility of direct evangelism in deeply multi-religious lands, and also an accommodation to local demands for secular education. This was, of course, prior to the official and legal formation of a sectarian state, at which point the dynamic of sectarian changed. So, the third example. We can look at comments made by then Senator Joseph Biden in the US on the question of sectarian violence in Iraq. So, let's listen to his answer. And then I'd like to talk about how he uses the term sectarianism.
Here's your final question. The Iraq Study Group report says that, quote, Iraqi police cannot control crime and they routinely engage in sectarian violence, including the unnecessary detention, torture, and targeted execution of Sunni Arab civilians, end quote. In effect, the U.S. is sponsoring and training Iraqi police who are engaged in ethnic cleansing. What should Congress do about this?
We should stop training the National Iraqi Police Force. 2 years prior to the Iraqi Study Group report, I wrote a similar report and debriefed then the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and the President of the United States on the very same thing. In my second and third trips to Iraq, I visited the police academy in Baghdad and then the training center in Jordan. And I pointed out there was no vetting of recruits, no way to weed out criminals, and that in fact sectarian thugs were making up the police force. That is why it is so critically important to give local control to the Sunni, Shia, and Kurds in their own regions within a united Iraq over their police force. The idea that a national Iraqi police force would be patrolling the streets of Basra or Kirkuk or any other part of the Sunni triangle is not. It's just beyond comprehension. It's not possible. That's why the Biden-Gell plan calls for local control over local police so that we don't end up in a situation where these thugs continue to undermine the security of neighborhoods. There's a room for a national army, but not for a national police force.
There was actually another clip that I wanted to show you. In the interest of having time for a Q&A, I'm going to try to wrap up here. There was another clip that I wanted to show you, which was actually from the vice presidential debates, the first time Biden was going to be elected, in which he argues that sectarianism has a long and deep history, going back millennia, which is a convenient way of sidestepping the single most important factor in the creation of a sectarian political disastrous reality in Iraq. The deliberate actions taken by the U.S. after the 2003 invasion and its collaboration with various sectarian factions which then emerged as a response to that situation. Instead, what we get here is an understanding of history in which religious others are read as racial others. The correct term for this is Orientalism, in which barbaric others are trapped in a violent past, who are incapable of moving past this kind of intractable violence, which is a product of especially their religious affiliation or tribal affiliation because of their religious background. The idea that sectarianism is inevitable is the single most dangerous perspective to have on it. This is why I've spent so much time today trying to explore how ideas about its varied histories and underlying ideas about the relationship of sectarianism to religion in media. This is why I've spent so much time with it. I think this is very important. Instead, what we need are critical perspectives about how it is made to seem inevitable. by those who profit from it at our expense. And media do play an important role in that process. Now, originally I was planning on, when I was much more ambitious about how quickly I could read, or how quickly I could talk, I want us to look at a series of examples. But I'll provide this, my presentation as a PDF to Levant so that you can take a look at those examples or others to see how these insights help you analyze them. So if you want to think about how maybe what I've been talking about might be useful in your attempts to engage in media literacy education, it might be useful as a set of cultural and historical or social observations which might inform a more specific analysis or more explicit analysis of media texts of various kinds. And I think I can boil it back down to 4 points, 4 questions to ask of media that we encounter. First you can ask, or the first 2 are kind of related. You can ask, what combination of factors define this sectarian structure? What media discourses, what media representations, what institutional structures, meaning both media institutions, state institutions, or political organizations of various kinds. How does violence underlie this? What does violence secure? What does violence do in society at a given point in time? The second question you can ask this very directly to the media text and how it uses the term sectarianism, if it uses it, is sectarianism the lens through which things are seen, or is it itself what needs explanation, or itself what the story tries to explain? Is sectarianism something in need of explanation, or is it itself the explanation for what's going on? Is there violence because there's sectarianism, or is there an attempt to try to understand sectarianism in a more complex way? The third question is about the historical context or cultural context. Specific ideas about sectarianism don't come out of a vacuum. They usually build on like a repertoire of ideas about those people are dirtier, those people are rude, those people never say what they really think. It builds on a kind of repertoire of caricatures. So you can think about what kinds of representations does it build from. And the fourth one, and this is the one that I think is maybe the most important, is does this representation or engagement with sectarianism help enable a future without it, or does it perpetuate and reproduce it? This is especially key when you have so many critiques of sectarianism in media itself. So in the interest of Q&A and me shutting up for a bit, we'll go to Q&A now. I'll stop talking. Thank you for your attention. I'll just stop here.
من خلال المحاضرة وكمان من خلال قراءة التاريخ لا يمكن لطائفة أن تقضي على طائفة أخرى أو دين يقضي على دين أو مذهب يقضي على مذهب. هذا يفترض أنه لابد من تعايش وقبول بالآخر بكل ما فيه. إذن ما هي هيكلية الخطاب الإعلامي الذي يجب أن نتوجه به إلى الجمهور ويعطينا هذه المعطيات: القبول بالآخر، التعاطي معه، قبوله كما هو بمذهبه، برأيه، بفكره، بمعتقداته المخالفة. ما هي الهيكلية التي يمكن أن نبني عليها خطابا إعلاميا جيد؟ شكرا.
فينا نحاول نفرجي إنه الطائفية منا شيء نزل من السماء مثل ما هي. فينا نفرجي كيف الميديا وأشياء لا آخره تبني وبتأسس وبتأثر بالطائفية. فينا نحاول نفكفكها مش نكملها. وهذا الشيء مثلا إذا الواحد فيه يعمل كامبين عليها، فيه يعمل مهرجانات عليها، فيه يعمل كثير قصص. في ناس وفي فعلا في ناس بكل البلدان اللي بنحكي فيها بيعملوا هالشيء بالميديا وغير قصص. مصر مثلا بعد ما صار في تدمير كنائس القبطية بمصر، في كثير ناس مسلمين صاروا يروحوا وهن يدافعوا عن الكنائس، وكمان المظاهرات اللي بلشت ب 2011 مثلا اذا في مسلمين يجوا يصلوا ويقفوا حواليهم، مش بس ليساعدوهم للناس يصلوا او يفرجوا لاصحابهم، ليفرجوا للميديا انه شوفوا في شيء ثاني. هيدي الشغله اللي عم تحاولوا تفرجوها انه في ارهاب وفي طائفيه، عشان هيك لازم نكون يفرجوا انه لا، هالشيء عم تحاولوا تخلقونا بيناتنا. وفي كثير تاريخ هالقصص بالعراق، بسوريا، في لبنان والى اخره، فلسطين.
أعتقد أن الإعلام لا يبني شيء من فراغ، إذا كان واقع ينقله ونحتاج شيء يتصنعه، يعني يخلق شيء. الخطاب الطائفي هو الإعلام لا يظهر من ذاته، هو يعتمد على خطباء، يعتمد على أفكار، على مذاهب دينية. هو الإعلام كيف يستطيع أن يقضي على الطائفية وما زال هذه المدارس أو الشخصيات تقوم بخطاب طائفي؟ الشق الثاني من السؤال أنه الإعلام منابر، كل منبر يسوق إلى طائفة معينة في قنوات تمثل خطابها الديني أو الطائفي، والجمهور كذلك لا سيما بالمنطقة العربية يعني لا يتقبل أن يتعرض إلى قنوات مخالفة للرأي، هو يعتمد ويثق بمصادر التي تمثل طائفته. وبهذا كيف يمكننا أن نقضي على الطائفية إذا ما زال هناك المصدر يبث الخطاب الطائفي والجمهور لا يلجأ إلى الآخر يتقبله، بل يعتمد بشكل مستمر على القنوات التي تمثل ذاته أو الفكر الذي يتبناه؟
شكرا لهالسؤال. بفتكر فينا نرجع لفكرة حاولت بلش فيها بس يمكن فيني وضحها أكثر هلا، إنه الطائفية مثل كلمة الدين بالكلمة الكبيرة بتكون شيء بتصير بالعالم، بس كمان شيء مخلوق، شيء خيالي، شيء فيكشنال. في مظبوط سياسات او اقتصادية او علاقات اقتصادية بتصير متعلقة بالطائفية، والناس اللي ببلشوا يتشاركوا بسياسة طائفية بيكونوا فهموا انه يعني اذا هيك ماشي اللعبة ما بدنا نخسر فيها. يمكن انا ما عندي شيء ضد حدا من جاندينه، بس اذا انا حاتاثر وانضر لانه انا مثلا هالطائفه، بدنا نشوف حقوقنا. بهالتفكير انا عندي جواب ثاني. بالوقت بس يبلشوا الناس يفكروا انه مصالحهم تتخلص بسياسه طائفيه، خصوا اللعبه. الطريقه الوحيده يربحوا هاللعبه انه ما يلعبوها او ينتهوها من اساسها قد ما فيهم بالمشاركه مع الطائفات الثانيه ببلدهم.
بيرجع قديش حجم البزنس اللي عم يصير. بيرجع قديش حجم البزنس. يعني اذا البزنس تبعه هو على مستوى الحاره والحي فبده يلعبها طائفيه، اذا البزنس على مستوى البلد فبيحطها طائفيه بس بيطلع يعني بيقول لك انا للجميع.
شوف السؤال كيف تنتهي الطائفيه، لو عندي هيدا الجواب هون انا بخلص كثير مشاكل. بس بقول انه بما انه هيدا الشيء اللي خلقت، هيدا الشيء فيها تتفكر، والميديا له دور بهالشيء انه يفرجي كيف هيدي مش الطريقه الوحيده بلد تتعاون بين بعضها. بعتذر اذا عربيتي شوي مكسبه.
طيب دكتور، في الفترة الأخيرة في كثير ملاحظة إنه باحثين الصحافة والإعلام بدخلوا في هذا الموضوع من بوابة بحس إنه فيها هم شخصي ضد الدين، وفي خوف من أكثر من دكتور وأكثر من باحث إنه الفضائيات الدينية رح تأثر على الخطاب. بس التجربة بتحكي عكس هيك، إنه طب احنا بنعطي وسائل الاعلام لرجال اعمال، ليش ما نعطيها لطوائف؟ احنا بنشتغل ان نفتك وسائل الاعلام لتكون قريبه من مثليي الجنس، من الملونين، من القبائل اللي الاعلام الجديد يرفضها. اشمعنى لا نريد لرجل الدين أن يؤسس وسيلة إعلام؟ وعلشان أطمنك أكثر، من حوالي 7 سنوات الفضائيات الدينية لحالها بتموت، تطلع وتشكل ظاهرة بس فجأة الناس ببطلوا يحضروها. أنا برأيي إنه المدخل اللي أنت مؤسس فيه للمحاضرة لتحليل الإعلام الديني قد يحدث مضاعفات واحتكاكات بين العقل الجديد والعقل التقليدي، والمتدينين لو أعطيناهم وسائل الإعلام بالإمكان إنه نفكك تعصبهم وعقدهم أكثر من أن نزاحمهم بأبحاث علمية زي هيك.
هيدا بفرق. شكرا على هيدا الجواب. بفتكر هيدا اللي شو عم تقوله والاحداث يعني عم تحكي فيها، وهيدا الشيء انه بيصير كل ميديا متميل لطائفه او متميل لمنتهج ديني. بيفرجي كيف هيدي بتبلش يمكن كفيكشن بس بترجع بتصير رياليتي. بكل معنى انه مثلا بلبنان كل قناه تلفزيون فضائي متميل ل يا طائفه او اذا بدك مش بس طائفه يبنوا مثلا في كذا انواع الطوائف بيختلفوا بين بعض، بس انه لمجتمع سياسي، لتيار سياسي مثلا يلي بيحكي انه نحن عم نفرجي حقوق ما بعرف شو حقوق الاثنين.
طب وين المشكله يا دكتور انه الطوائف تبذل مطالبها السياسيه؟ هاي ديمقراطيه حتى في الدين مطلوبه للشرع.
هيدا بس بيكون ديمقراطي من معنى انه كل مين بيقدر يقول رايه، بس شو بيصير، بس شو بيعمل كمان؟ بيخلق انواع، ودائما بيكون متاسس بشيء عكس الديمقراطي، هو العنف، وهو نوع الوطنيه، مش وطنيه، نوع وطنيه. ثاني شيء، اول شيء طائفي، يعني بيبطل في شيء اسمه ديمقراطي برات هذا السيستم. يعني مثل كيف اذا بدك بامريكا خلقوا انه الناس السود بس بينتخبوا يعني شخص من هاللون، او الناس الاسيويه بس بينتخبوا. هيدا اذا هيدا ديمقراطي، هي انا ما بدي ديمقراطي.
ديمقراطية مقنعة.
قديش انه الخطاب الطائفي بالاعلام مرتبط بالحاله الاقتصاديه؟ لانه كنا نشوف المجتمعات عم تروح نحو فقر اكثر، تعتير اكثر، كل ما كان الخطاب الديني هو مقنع اكثر بالنسبه لهم، بصير اللجوء للدين، يعني مثل اذا بنرجع لاوروبا بالعصور الوسطى، اللجوء للدين هو الناحيه اللي ممكن اخي الله ما رايد لك هلا يصير معك مصاري. هو عم بيلتجئ اكثر لهيك الخطاب الطائفي هون بصير اكثر، الناس عم تتشربوا بشكل اكبر بكثير، فما لو كانوا الناس ملتهين باشغالهم واعمالهم عم يدوروا كيف يدوروا ويعملوا تنميه. بنشوف كثير بلدنا العربيه اليوم الخطاب الديني كثير متاثر فيها بسبب حاله اقتصاديه عم تعيشها، مو باسباب ثانيه.
انا بقول انه اصعب شيء يمكن فينا نعمله نلاقي طائفيه بدون ما نلاقي مصلحه ورا منها. مصلحه من معنى السيطره على شيء مرتبط بالحكومه، او كمان مسيطره على مصاري بالاخر. يعني بتكون انه نحن مجموعتنا بدنا نعمل مصاري من هالشيء، يلا كلكم انتم كشيعة ما بعرف شو، يلا انتم كلكم نحن عاده بنفكر بالدين انه الدين شيء مش متعلق بالاقتصاد او عكس الاقتصاد او شيء هيك، بس من الفكره السوسيولوجي مثلا ما بنشوف هالشيء ابدا. يعني ولا في شيء اسمه الدين منه متاثر بالكابيتاليزم، ما بتصير. يعني اذا المصاري بتتميل على الجيب هيك بهالطرق، فبصير العلاقات الاقتصاديه تتميل بالطائفيه. يعني 100% fully forward compatible. يعني السوفت وير ماشي سوا.
يصير هذا اللي عندك.
I feel like I'm cheating because I can ask you this anytime, but I'd be interested in hearing how the audience feels about this question as well. I was interested in drawing the parallel between sectarianism and accusations of sectarianism being like an accusation of racism. And this is something that I found in my own research as well. I conducted interviews with filmmakers with the idea that filmmakers were particularly anti-sectarianism. But almost as soon as the question, like, are you opposed to sectarianism, came out of my mouth, I realized that it would be the same as asking, like, how do you feel about racism? Do you think that pollution is bad? That sort of thing. But I had the thought while you were talking that perhaps for certain politicians, the idea you can be a politician who benefits from sectarianism at the same time that you are criticizing sectarianism. But what your criticism might mean is, I don't have enough power. There's too many other people who have power too. Is it possible that sectarianism can also be a code for, like, because if you consider like an alternate to an alternative to sectarianism is like, having one homogenous power, that seeing sectarianism as a problem is a way of saying, like, I don't have enough power because too many other people are also vying for power.
In the examples I was going to have us discuss together, there was actually a clip which is Nasrallah openly accusing the people and groups that he sees as his opponents, the March 14th Future Movement, of sectarian incitement or at the very least collaborating with sectarian politics. It's very easy to see in any places that have a sectarian politics, people accusing the other side of sectarianism, or saying, look, I'm not sectarian, but what about my people's rights? It's a great cheap shot to make. It's like, oh, look, here's a point where I'm standing up for all citizens of this country. I believe in all citizens of all country, but you are like the bad sectarian one, which itself can be a great ally. It's a great way to sort of score some political points or to fluff one's image, while at the same time doing so in a very sectarian way. So I think we have to be absolutely skeptical about public critiques of sectarianism, because everybody will accuse somebody else of being sectarian in a way that reproduces a sectarian dynamic, which in no way kind of undoes or abdicates from the politics of sectarianism. So yes, I think there's many places where we can see people accusing each other of being sectarian while themselves participating in it.
Heather?
بصراحة ممكن يكون كلامي بنوع من التشاؤم، لكن المشكلة أصبحت ليست في وسائل الإعلام فقط أو المنابر الإعلامية. يعني الطائفية استطاعت أن تحدث تأثيرا فينا نوعا ما بالتفكير والسلوك نحن كأفراد. ذلك ما تجلى في العراق حتى بنوع اختيار العلاقات الإنسانية. يعني لا يمكن أن نستقر على رأي لمدة معينة، أوضاعنا غير مستقرة، بين الحين والآخر تظهر أصوات للطائفية أو عدم قبول الآخر. أنا برأيي نحتاج إلى الكثير من الوقت حتى نستطيع أن نتقبل نحن الآخر كفكر وكسلوك، وليس فقط تأثير دور وسائل الإعلام. كثير من وسائل الإعلام هي كانت عامل مساعد، حتى وسائل الإعلام الجديد هي إلى الآن فيها قنوات تدعو للطائفية، وإذا وجدت نقاش بسيط جدا تجد هناك الاتهامات والتهجمات، أنت من الطائفة الفلانية وأنا من الطائفة ولا تتدخل، رغم نحن ممكن أن نكون في منطقة واحدة أو يعني تربطنا علاقات يعني قوية، لكن مع ذلك يبدأ التصاعد الطائفي. ما أعرف، أنا أعتقد أنه نحتاج كثير من الوقت لهذه المسألة، وليس فقط الإعلام، نحن المسألة فينا ليس في وسائل الإعلام. شكرا.
أنا معك، الطائفية مثل سم وبس ينشرب كثير صعب الواحد يخلص منه، بس كمان في شغلة ثانية فينا نفكر فيها، إنه في كثير قصص كانت شكلها إنه ما معقول مئات السنين ما بتخلص وما رح نخلص منها، والجمعة بتمرق وتفكفكت بالمرة ولا نتوقع إنه كيف تفكفكت. مثلا السوفيت يونيون بجمعة وقت البرولين وول كأنه ما كان في شيء، كأنه السنين اللي من قبل اللي كانت مش موجودة. فينا نشوف هالشيء بكذا محلات. لا اتحول للإنجليزي لأنه ما رح أعرف كيف ترجم هالمثل بشكل مضبوط. Things are impossible until they become inevitable. And it is inevitable that eventually sectarianism loses its coherence. It stops functioning. It stops being able to organize people. Now, how that happens is anyone's guess. And I agree with you that media is an important part of how people continue to understand the world in sectarianism, in sectarian terms, or to understand how they have to understand themselves or their relationship to others in a sectarian way. But there's nothing inevitable about it. I think do we have time for one more? There's an eager hand in the back.
One more, sure. Last one.
Green shirt. I saw it first, I'm sorry. شفتك أول شيء ما لا شيء.
طيب يمكن انا المحاضره بطلت اعرف وين الحد اللي بنحكي بعده هذا طائفيه واللي قبله هذا مش طائفيه. لما عرضت الكنيسه اللي فيها مرافق كثير كانها كانت مرافق كثير تابعه لها. امتى بتصير الطائفيه؟ امتى بتصير الموضوع طائفيه وامتى بيكون لساتها بحدود التعايش والاندماج؟ يعني هل حفاظ كل مجموعه على خصوصيتها وتميزها، لان احنا يعني ما نضحكش على بعض، كل مجموعه بتختلف عن الثانيه، تتميز بشيء، مش احكي بتختلف، تتميز بشيء مميز عن الثانيين. لما هذه المجموعه تحافظ على خصوصيتها ممكن تسوي في مجموعات كل مثلا عندها يوم معين في الاسبوع بتعرض فيه ممارسات الدينيه او شيء زي هيك، فهي خصوصيه. امتى بصير الموضوع طائفيه وامتى بيكون لسه في اطار الاندماج والتعايش؟
هلا جواب هالسؤال بيختلف بطريقه اللي عم نوصف كلمه الطائفيه. انا بفتكر الطائفيه اول شيء بيكون سيستم، ما بيكون بس تعصب او بس اتيتيود او بس فكره. لتكون طائفيه مضبوط لازم يكون في مثلا سيستم سياسي اللي هو متعلق، مش انا بقول مش بالدين، لانه كلمه الدين very complex مثل كيف شفنا، متعلقه بهويه الهويه ما تختلف عن شو هو يمكن تاريخ الدين. لتكون طائفيه لازم يكون في سياسه متعلقه بحقوق، متعلقه بحقوق الوطن، بكيف الناس بينتخبوا، كيف الناس بيقدروا ياخذوا حقوقهم. فممكن تكون عندك تعصب طائفي بدون الطائفيه، وهيدي يلي فينا نشوفها. هلا في كثير قصص كثير بشعه، الناس كثير افكارهم مليانه بالكره لناس من غير دين، بس يمكن يكون هالشيء بدون تكون طائفه بالمعنى اللي انا عم بوصفه. يمكن مش المعنى الوحيد اللي فينا نستعملها، يعني انا بس هيك عم بستعملها لان شو عم بقول يكون عنده شيء يتعلق ببعض، يكون عنده منطق.
Thank you.